Okay, so I'll be talking about vowel writing. Let me just start by timer as well. Vowel writing and the role of grammar in writing system evolution. I want to advance two theses. The first one is empirical, which is that when writing is transmitted within the Afroasiatic family, vowel writing is systematically neglected, versus when it's transmitted beyond Afroasiatic and you see an increase in vowel writing. This observation isn't new. There are some quotations up the top here that you can see from the middle of the 19th century that already push in this direction. But so far as I know, nobody has sat down and done the empirical legwork to show that this is a robust phenomenon. So that's the first part of the talk. Once you've established that that's robust, the question is, why does it hold? And this leads to 1b, the analytic thesis. And I want to claim that this is a response to grammatical differences, that vowels play very different roles in Afroasiatic versus non-Afroasiatic languages, and that the underrepresentation of vowels therefore has very different consequences depending which family you belong to. This project forms part of this research forms part of a broader project, which is to argue that grammar is a driving force in writing system evolution. So writing systems adapt to the grammar of the languages they're used to write, and changes in grammar, especially via what you might call an ecological catastrophe, so adoption for another language, can result in maladaptation, which then triggers further evolution of the system. Just briefly, I won't go through this in detail. You need to sharpen the question. There are some misunderstandings in the literature about the extent of vowellessness in Afroasiatic, especially Semitic writing. You do get genuine cases of vowelless writing, such as in some Phoenician texts, but in other texts, such as 2b, the Old Testament, many vowels are represented, but they tend to be represented in ways that are both optional and ambiguous. So the real empirical generalization that I'm aiming for, so the right question is, how does vowel writing change in completeness and obligatoriness when Afroasiatic writing systems that underrepresent vowels either partially or completely are transferred within versus beyond the family? So the first part of this talk is encyclopedic, and I could stop on any number of the cases and go into them in more depth, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to have to sort of helicopter over them. So we'll begin in 3 with transmission beyond Afroasiatic, within Afroasiatic. And I'd like to emphasize that the sociolinguistic settings of the cases that I'm going to overview are quite varied. There's the same script used in different languages. There's the same language used with different scripts. There's transfer in the presence versus absence of education systems, particularly religious ones. There's transfer in the presence of multiple scripts, and there are instances of ancient and modern transfer. This variation notwithstanding, the outcome is the same, 3b, that vowel writing barely increases at the point of transfer. So beginning with Berber, which we'll visit 3 times in the course of this talk, in the ancient system, derived from Phoenician, you've got almost complete vowellessness. Just to take one word at random, you see that in this word Susa, there are 4 consonants and 2 vowels. And if you look over here, you see that there are 4 graphemes and that they correspond only to the vowels, only to the consonants, sorry. In a modern variety, which reads left to right, you'll notice that there are some, so for instance, this final glottal stop is used to represent a, but there are plenty of other vowels that aren't represented in this string. So vowellessness persists. A different form of Berber writing explored by Swag is the use of Arabic script for various Berber and Berber influenced languages. I won't go through them in detail. You can see from the bold facing that there are many vowels that aren't written. And in particular, these examples here in 3C are interesting because you get the same string written ambiguously as to its vocalization. and this occurs in a didactic context. So it's assumed that speakers are able to bring quite a lot of knowledge to even to the task of learning the language. Judeo-Arabic is a case which I will just fly past, and I'll linger for a bit longer on Arabic because I think it's a very interesting case. The Arabic script was developed by Nabateans who spoke Arabic but wrote Aramaic, which showed great linguistic sophistication. So for instance, as you can see in the tables down here, Aramaic collapsed various sounds that remained, various sounds from Proto-Semitic that remained distinct in Arabic. So when it came time to write Arabic, there was a need to develop more consonantal system as well. There weren't enough symbols. And so what the language and what the writing system invested in was more consonants, not more vowels, which is interesting fact number one for this study. So they're perfectly happy still not to write vowels, even though they're overhauling the writing system. And then what they did was to basically do reconstruction, so phonological analysis of the comparative analysis of Aramaic and Arabic, and then where they found sounds that corresponded, they chose symbols that corresponded by adding an extra dot. So you can see the th has an extra dot on the t, ch extra dot on the h, and so on. So this is clearly sophisticated, and yet readers and writers of this sophistication were perfectly happy, even though they're redesigning the system, not to invest in vowels. Ugaritic, an interesting case because it's cuneiform in appearance, but still consonantal in character, also has only very minimal investment in vowels, even though it's a redesign of the system. And arguably the oldest case we find, the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions, if you think through them, show the same dearth of vowels. So that's a quick overview of some key Semitic cases, Afroasiatic cases, most of them Semitic. So let's now go on to transmission beyond Afroasiatic. Donor scripts include Arabic, Aramaic, Egyptian, Hebrew, Phoenician. Once again, there's a range of families that borrow the scripts. There are a range of borrowing scenarios, and there's once again a uniform outcome, which is that vowel writing on the whole becomes more complete and more obligatory than we've seen up to this point. So the obvious starting point for cultural reasons for this, given the history of the field, is Phoenician, and what we see in Phoenician is a repurposing of, Greek, what we see is a repurposing of sounds that were useless to Greeks, so things like laryngeals, pharyngeals, and they're repurposed as vowels in Greek. In Iberian, which arguably also comes from Phoenician, there are standalone sounds for vowels, and then and for continuance, and then other consonants are written via CV syllabograms, which therefore makes the writing of vowels obligatory. Meroitic, which is along with the alphabet and therefore most of the world's current writing systems, the descent also basically does what Iberian does. It has a few pure vowel signs, a small, and then a smaller number of CV syllabograms. Once again, you end up therefore with more or less obligatory marking of many or most vowels. Brahmi and Kharoshthi, very interesting Indic systems. Originally, the languages that they wrote, Prakrit Sanskrit, were written with Aramaic via many consonants used for invented. They pushed this further with investment in vowel-specific symbols. So a nice example in this word for body, sharira, you can see r over here, which looks a bit like a Hebrew Aramaic r, and that's pronounced ra, and then for ri, you take the same symbol and you put a diacritic, a slash through it. Sogdian and Uyghur, actually Sogdian and Uyghur and Persian are kind of interesting. In both cases, you've got a Semitic language as the donor. You get an initial transmission to an Iranian language, and then onwards to other families from there, eventually leading to some full alphabets. such as Manchurian, I think. Yeah, Manchurian, ClearScript, and Kurdish are fully alphabetic. But even before that, you find pretty extensive use of pretty extensive vowel writing. So for instance, in Bahu Hutao, the A is written by a glottal stop, the U is written by a W, and only this vowel here, the A, is unwritten. I'm probably going to need to stop doing this helicoptering now. I have a number of cases from Africa showing the same thing. Once again, many different, largely similar sociolinguistic settings in that there's transmission of the writing system through Islam. But vowel writing becomes obligatory and is quite inventive as well. It's very varied within text as to how it's done and across text as to how it's done, but the obligatoriness is largely invariant. More examples from Yiddish and Judeo-Spanish. And basically they all show the same thing. So the correlation is then in 23, the following. Within Afroasiatic, there's minimal increase in vowel writing at points of transfer. Beyond Afroasiatic, there is substantial increase in vowel writing. I had a statistical project on the go when lockdown began, and the project unfortunately couldn't be continued. But the initial findings were that these results, which I've given narratively, are also statistically robust. So then the question, so that's the empirical thesis, which I think is largely unsurprising. The question really is, why does it hold? You could imagine several phonological explanations, such as you don't get good matches between vowel inventories in the two languages, or between consonant inventories, either in the languages or the scripts, or syllable structure might be largely different. However, there are enough cases where there are very good matches between donor and recipient on any or all of these criteria, and yet you still get this increase in vowel writing. So I think it's unlikely to be phonological. And the hypothesis I'll pursue in 25, that we're dealing with something morphosyntactic. Crucially, vowels encode morphosyntactic information in Afroasiatic languages, morphosyntactic information can be omitted because language-wide factors constrain the search space for missing vowels. Morphosyntax then constrains it further. Missing vowels are often recoverable from consonants alone with minor ambiguity. And for the residue of unresolved cases, the written language approximates a morphologically impoverished language. That's to say, one that's grammatically legitimate. So to explain this, let me do a full start. You might imagine that the reason you get vowel-reduced writing in Hebrew, but not in English, say, is 26b, that in English, the consonant string PRT can be vocalized as part, pert, port, prat, prate, parrot, pirate, and so on. Whereas in Hebrew, it's much more limited, prat, peret, parat, porat, and that's about it. However, when you think about that longer, it looks suspicious. There are many consonant strings in English that don't allow multiple vocalizations, like njk. That's got to be magic, it can't be mujak. Whereas in Hebrew, most strings allow multiple, even if not hugely many vocalizations. So putting flesh on the bones of this hunch, there's a really interesting work by Robert Crellin, who sets out to recreate the circumstances of one of the major transfers, that's to say the Phoenician to Greek transfer. And what he does is to use Hebrew as a proxy for Phoenician, and he rewrites various Greek texts via Hebrew norms in two different ways. And texts are well matched, so there's the Pentateuch in both of them, and then there are historical texts, Judges versus Herodotus, Xenophon. And then he measures ambiguity as a product of tokens and types for the first 80,000 words of each text. And what he finds is that ambiguity without vowels was higher in Hebrew, the language that actually managed without writing them. It's only in one experiment that Greek is more ambiguous than Hebrew, and only by about 10%, whereas in all other measures, Hebrew is the more ambiguous, at times by a much greater factor, 50 to 100%. So ambiguity here is not the driving force. How long have I got? 15. Okay, I want to be done in 5 to 10 minutes. So let's consider what the driving force really is. It's well acknowledged in work on these writing systems that the consonantal root is central to Semitic and Afroasiatic languages. So for instance, the difference between read and write, kara, katav, I'll use Hebrew for simplicity, inheres only in the vowels. But it's an oversimplification to say that vowels play no role in lexical meaning, though I don't think the point was appreciated till quite recently. So Arad 2005 points out that lexical meaning is really the result of a consonant plus a vocalic pattern. And once you've picked your vocalic pattern, then only then do you fix the lexical meaning. And if you take a root and give it two different vocalic patterns, the lexical meaning can vary systematically in later derivations. So the point is that underrepresentation of vowels has a cost to lexical meaning in Afroasiatic languages. So what does then limit the search space for recovering vowels? The first factor is language-wide. So there are certain vowel patterns that are just impossible or very marginal in these languages. So for instance, bonus, chorus, nodule, they're all fine. So o, u, or a is fine as an English vowel string, but not as a Hebrew one. E is very marginal in Hebrew, but fine in English, limit, lipid, visit. So the number of vowels that you need to run through is smaller. So that's the first factor, you have a limited search space. This search space is then limited further by morphosyntax. So for instance, again, sticking with Hebrew, the pattern is restricted to nouns. The pattern a, u is restricted to adjectival participles, and so on. So if you have a cue, for instance, if you're in a verb initial language and you know that you're starting a sentence, then you know that you're not going to be looking at the pattern. Similarly, clitics may give the game away. If you find a prepositional clitic like b or l, then you know you're not looking at a finite verb. So that's the second factor that limits the search space and facilitates underrepresentation of vowels. The third is this very interesting feature that from the consonants that you write, you can, from the affixal consonants, you can predict the root vowels. So to see this, take a string like fxing in English. You know from phonotactics as an English speaker that there must be two missing vowels. And you recognize that part of that belongs to an affix. Now from you know you must be dealing with ing, but filling in that vowel does not help you fill in the last vowel. You could be looking at faxing, fixing, foxing. In Afroasiatic, you are able to make that last step, the one that's missing from English. So for instance, if you see your triconsonantal string with a T with T's at either end, then you can guess the vocalization is going to be I or E. So tizmoret, tichtovet, tirshomet, orchestra correspondence details. Similarly, if you're flanked by H's, you're going to get something like hasbara, hasarak, hakdama. Then it's not completely unambiguous. And for monoconsonantal roots, for monoconsonantal affixes, you get more options. So nksh could be niksha or nakasher, it was tied, and we will tie. But remember, syntax is also going to help you. Are you dealing with a passive? Are you dealing with a third person in the context that you happen to be reading? So those are the three factors. And the last one that I think is important is that when you write without vowels, what you're doing is missing out a morpheme. And this ties into other things that we see in the history of writing. So to give you an example, so up here, actually, no, I'll just do this one here, 32. So in classical Hebrew, the string shbra, the consonant string, could be voiced as either shiber or shuvar. That's to say, broke, transitive, or broke, or got broken. So that's to say that in the spoken language, you had a causative and coative alternation, but in the written language, you didn't. And that's precisely what we have in English. So I broke it versus it broke is a causative coative incausation, a causative incoative alternation, but that is morphologically unmarked. And if it's fine for English to get away without writing it, without saying it, then what you've got in Hebrew is just saying it, but not writing it. There are three interesting parallels. Just let me glance at the time again. There are three interesting parallels of this comparison from artificial language learning, the invention of writing and the transmission of writing. In the interest of time, I'll just do the last two of those. So take this Chinese character, which is read ambiguously as cheng or sheng in modern Chinese. This corresponded in Baxter Sagar's reconstruction of Old Chinese to a sesquisyllable and the same sesquisyllable with a morpheme added. And it was up to the reader to supply this missing morpheme when they were reading. Similarly, in early Japanese writing, what was actually written was syntactically and morphologically Chinese, and the Japanese reader just had to supply the morphemes on the fly. Sumerian was similar. Eventually, writing began to get more and more morphologically explicit, as you can see here in 36b. But you'll notice that a lot of the morphemes in this line are in bold, 5 of them, in fact. And if you go back in time a few centuries and look at the same text, then all of those bold morphemes were unwritten, and it was up to the reader to supply them when reading. How long have I got? I guess I need to make a choice. Let's go back to Berber one last time to round things off. Berber, in Kabyle Berber, the adoption of Arabic was like other cases in Africa by non-Afroasiatic languages. It involved obligatory writing of vowels. There are various sociolinguistic factors that you shouldn't discount in looking for an explanation of why Kabyle Berber, in contrast to other Berber varieties, went in this direction. But grammar is certainly one that we should consider again. I've been speaking of Afroasiatic grammar as though it's uniform, but the extent of these intercalating templates, as opposed to what's more common cross-linguistically, namely concatenation of morphemes, varies within the family. And Berber may be more like a non-Afroasiatic language in the relevant respects, and it might be interesting to look at how Zen goes in this respect as well. So in particular, 38C, several root consonants don't emerge phonetically in Kabyle Berber. So in this root, to write, in various forms, you actually only end up with one consonant surfacing. And this is reminiscent of the way in which matras lectionis, so consonants used for vowels, emerged in Hebrew. Unfortunately, I don't have time to say anything more about that, so I will just conclude. Vowel writing remains most constant when systems are passed within the Afroasiatic family, and increases when writing systems is passed beyond them. The sudden massive innovation of vowels, whether by diacritics, letters, or syllabograms, appears exclusively within non-Afroasiatic systems like Brahmi, Greek, Iberian, Kharoshthi, Meroitic. The driving force behind vowel expansion is morphosyntactic, not phonological or purely cultural. only Afroasiatic languages structure their lexical and functional vocabulary such that removal of vowels minimally affects lexical vocabulary and amounts on the whole to impoverishment of functional vocabulary. A finding or a hypothesis that's supported by other writing systems that underrepresented functional vocabulary at various stages in their history. More broadly then, grammar is a key force that shapes writing systems in their evolution. Okay, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that very rich and very informative talk. We have a first question by Ben Young.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very, very informative. I really appreciated it. Secondly, so my question was regarding the Ethiopic writing system. You touched very briefly on gʁas, and so in the development of the Ethiopic writing system, you have a Semitic to Semitic language transfer from South Semitic, ancient South Semitic, ancient South Arabian language to gʁas. And, but in that case, you do have a complete development, a mass innovation, as you were calling it, of vowel indications. And from what I understand about gʁ's grammar, it's close enough to, I mean, like in terms of paradigm, it's fairly similar in terms of like Arabic or Hebrew or any other like sort of core Semitic language.
Shall I, if you have something else to say, or shall I comment on that?
Well, that's about it. Yeah. What?
Okay. Yeah, I would like to look at this in more detail. I happen to be working on Tigrinya now for a different reason, which is a nice way into gʁs. There are a few things I'd say. First, so my understanding of the history is that vowel writing, so there are some interesting caves on the island of Socotra that show Indic writing with vowels and early gʁs writing at the same time, which suggests that there is cultural contact that could have led to the transmission of vowels. Where vowels initially occur, I believe, is in the Bible and just for Jesus's speech. So nobody gets vowels except for Jesus, presumably because his word has to be recorded exactly. And then as time goes on, vowels spread. And this happens in a situation where you then have many non-native gʁs speakers trying to read the texts. And so I wonder whether the expansion of vowels is, in this case, driven by sociolinguistic factors, which may also explain the rise in morpheme writing in Sumerian. So this is a time of greater contact with Akkadian speakers. And then also similar use of vowel writing in vowel diacritics in Hebrew Arabic. Why it becomes obligatory, it's harder to say, maybe because gʁs becomes a liturgical language faster and with fewer native speakers. Yeah, I think I have some more thinking to do there, but it seems to me that there are very plausible sociolinguistic factors at play in that particular example that make me think that it isn't a case that I would regard as a counterexample to the general line of reasoning that I've been pursuing here. But if anyone knows more, I'm very interested to hear.
Just spitballing slightly, do you think that possibly the format of the vowels too, in the case that in like, for example, in the development of full vowel writing for, say, Greek or Brahmi, you have the vowels are somewhat more intrusive on the consonants, and in the Ethiopic writing system, the vowels are, the basic consonantal structure is still visible in some ways and not really perturbed as much by the vowel markings. I don't know if I'm spitballing as whether that might be influential or not.
That is really interesting. I mean, the problem I have is that I don't want to use my hunch notion. I get the intuition, but I feel it needs to be put on more objective ground. But I completely see where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'd love to actually continue this conversation offline at some point too.
Sure.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much.
Second question by Amalia Gnanadesikan.
Hi, I have sort of three interrelated questions slash comments. And one is that I see that a lot of your examples involve a switch of the scripts, something like, Aramaic to Brahmi. That's a huge difference, not just in the way vowels are written, but the shape of the scripts. But whereas something like Arabic to Persian to Uyghur, so forth, is within a script. And so on the one hand, I wonder whether you've compared how it works, whether you're within a script or cross script like that. And then along the lines of staying within a script, if you stay within Arabic, you mentioned Kurdish, just as a comment. Kurdish doesn't actually write all its vowels. There's one unwritten vowel.
Oh, I've been believing the advertising.
And there is one unwritten vowel. So it's a sort of interesting case that suggests that leaving one vowel unwritten may also be a sort of stable state in script evolution. And the other comment there is that in Urdu, they have split the E vowel into two different vowels, but only in final position. There's one that writes E and one that writes A. And they're variant forms of the Arabic letter Ya. And that is because the difference between E and A is morphologically important. It shows gender and plurality.
Yeah.
So it's a case where, in fact, the grammar is driving the representation of vowels rather than vice versa.
Yeah. So one thing you asked has a very short answer. The answer is no. So have I considered wholesale redesign versus continuity of script? No, and you're completely right. I'll add that into the statistical analysis that's still ongoing. And the other case, yeah, the Urdu one, and so the other two are observations, and I'll definitely take them on board. Thanks very much.
And very short last question by Gordian Schreiber.
Yeah, more like a comment than a question, or maybe a question to myself as well. So I was wondering about the unwritten morphemes you were talking about, and about the Japanese case, which I've myself looked a little bit more in depth. I was looking for parallel cases in other writing systems. So, for example, in Classic Mayan, you have at least a partially unwritten passive morpheme, actually. So this might be another case for this type of unwritten morphemes, which seems to be much rarer than unwritten phonemes, right? And the other one, you talked about Chinese, the old Chinese, this S suffix. I was wondering whether it's possible to try to analyze it as a form of polyvalence. So that the same graph is writing, so the one morphographic value would be the S suffix, the word with the S suffix, and the other one would be without the S suffix. So if you treat it as a form of polyvalence, you don't have to call it unwritten. But I'm not sure. That's just a question.
So briefly on Mayan, it's a system I want to look at, haven't gotten there yet, but I'll definitely bear the passive in mind because it'd be a nice example. It's precisely, I wanted to find a passive example. With regard to Chinese, I've had the same question. I don't have enough epigraphic expertise, but I would be very curious to know whether, not just for this morpheme, but for the many, dozens of morphemes that Baxter and Sagar analyze, and I should say in brackets, they're also there implicitly in Zheng Zhang's reconstruction. He just doesn't draw them out. So of these morphemes, how many of them are represented systematically, for instance, by the means you're talking about? I really don't know, and I think it requires someone with proper expertise in both the language and the writing system to tackle that, because it's a very large statistical task.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We are very late, but just another short question by Natalia Elvira.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask about, well, specifically about the transfer from Semitic to Greek, which is the case that I know best. So it has been proposed that in this transfer, one of the main issues for which Greeks tried to write down vowels was because they have words that start with vowels, which is more of a lexical rather than a morphological issue in most cases. And also, it is noteworthy that Phoenician used matres lectionis very marginally, and the examples that we have are to write down foreign personal names, which would also imply a lexical rather than a morphological issue. I wanted to ask your opinion on this.
Gosh, they're both complex questions. I mean, vowel initial words, we don't know what the status, the phonological status of the glottal stop was in Phoenician. So was it really pronounced, or was it sometimes just used, or was it, you know, there at some level of representation, but in actual speech missed out, as happens in several Semitic languages, so that what you get is in essence a vowel initial word. So I would be cautious about investing too much in that particular difference between Phoenician and Greek. But with proper names, you're right, I haven't thought through this properly, but it's something you see time and again. So ancient Egyptian does the same thing. I believe, what's that called? Ugaritic did the same thing, that vowels are more common when you're trying to get, when you're trying to write down foreigners' names, or also when you're writing for foreigners and you want them to be 100% sure of what you're saying. But let me think. I guess the point of those words is that they're simultaneously lexically odd, but they're also morphologically odd. They're morphologically unanalyzable within your language. And so they give the experienced reader no clues as to their pronunciation. So I guess that means that they may be neutral between the kind of hypothesis that I'm pushing based on grammatical causes versus one that invests more in the lexicon. So I think you can have an explanation of those facts either way. That's my half-baked, off-the-cuff answer.
Thank you very much.